A faded black and white photograph flickers onto the screen. 22 young girls, all dressed in identical, modest uniforms, their faces frozen in time with forced smiles, eyes wide with the quiet weight of childhoods shaped by abandonment. The image lingers for a moment, then burns away, edges curling with the hiss of unseen flames, revealing a different scene. Fog-drenched woods, branches clawing at the sky, and the skeletal ruins of an old building. Its bricks weathered, windows shattered, like hollow eyes staring into nothingness. Over this unsettling transition, the narrator's voice breaks through low, steady, carrying a chilling gravity. Asterisk, they were young, innocent, forgotten by the world, until the world forgot them completely. Thunder cracks in the distance, as shadows twist through the fog, the forest swallowing all traces of civilization. Asterisk, on a storm-lashed night in 1977, 22 girls vanished from Bellview Orphanage, without a sound, without a trace. The screen shudders with static, revealing an old, crackled newspaper clipping. Asterisk, 22 missing from Bellview. Orphanage investigation launched. Asterisk, the edges of the page tremble in the phantom wind as distant, faint children's laughter echoes, distorted. Wrong. Asterisk, no witnesses, no bodies, only silence, and the whisper of something far more sinister. The haunting notes of a broken piano bleed into the scene, keys pressed by invisible hands, discordant and unsettling. As the screen fades to black, a cold grey sea churns beneath jagged cliffs as the camera sweeps over the rugged coastline of Maine. Waves slam into black rocks, sending plumes of salt water into the air, the endless expanse of the Atlantic stretching beyond the mist. Isolated fishing towns cling to the edges of the land weather-beaten homes, rusted boats bobbing in empty harbors, streets that seem untouched by time yet heavy with history. The narrator's voice cuts through the low hum of the wind, calm, but laced with unease. Asterisk, the coast of Maine is a place of rugged beauty and quiet despair. The drone dips lower, following a winding, forgotten road that snakes through the dense pine forest. Trees pressed tight together like sentinels guarding secrets long buried beneath the moss and soil. Asterisk, here, nestled among the mist and pine, Bellview Orphanage stood, weathered, forgotten, a sanctuary for society's lost children. Faded archival footage flickers onto the screen. A towering stone building, Gothic in design, its peaked rooftops and arched windows battered by decades of storms. The orphanage looms on the outskirts of town, its silhouette etched against the overcast sky. The walls are crumbling, ivy clawing at the facade, its once grand entrance sagging beneath the weight of neglect. Children's laughter drifts faintly over the scene, but it's warped, unnerving, like an old record played just slightly off speed. Asterisk, but in 1977, that sanctuary became something else. The footage fractures into static as the camera lingers on the orphanage's empty windows, dark, hollow, staring back like the eyes of something long dead, or merely waiting. Faded photographs crackle onto the screen rows of young faces, their smiles brittle, eyes clouded with something older than their years. These were the children of Bellview Orphanage, the forgotten, gathered beneath its crumbling stone walls. 22 girls, aged 7 to 15. Each one marked by the quiet scars of abandonment, their lives tethered to a place that promised shelter, but rarely offered more. Their portraits fade in and out, the girls with tightly braided hair, threadbare uniforms, some clinging to one another, others standing apart, guarded even before the darkness would truly descend. Over these images, the narrator's voice tightens with quiet dread. Asterisk at Bellview, the forgotten were gathered, orphans abandoned to fate. Asterisk, a new photograph surfaces headmistress Evelyn Harrow. Her expression is etched in stone, sharp. Features, hair pulled into a severe bun, eyes narrowed behind wire-rimmed glasses. No warmth softens the lines of her face. She stands rigid, one hand gripping a leather-bound ledger, posture as unyielding as the crumbling institution behind her. Asterisk Headmistress Harrow, a woman of rigid discipline, whose authority over Bellview was absolute. Her legacy wrapped in whispers of harsh punishments and strict religious doctrine, lingers in the faded ink of old inspection reports and the cautious recollections of those who survived their time beneath her rule. The screen shifts to grainy, black and white footage, sprawling, overgrown grounds behind the orphanage. A solitary figure moves along the fence line. Thomas Pike, the groundskeeper, tall, wiry, face obscured beneath the brim of his cap, his presence radiates quiet unease. His clothes are worn, hands calloused, eyes wary. Town records list him as a recluse, a man whose ties to Bellevue stretch back decades, but whose reputation grew tangled in darker rumors, the strange hours he kept, the whispers of late night digging near the woods, the local children daring each other to spy on him. Asterisk Thomas Pike, the silent caretaker, with dark rumors trailing him like a shadow. Asterisk a sepia-toned newspaper clipping fades into view. Asterisk local preacher hosts orphanage, services faith for Maine's lost children. The accompanying photograph shows Reverend Caleb Mercer, his smile's stretched-tight eyes alight with fervor. Behind him, the modest clapboard church, its steeple looming against a storm-darkened sky. Mercer's presence at Bellevue was frequent sermons, counseling, late-night prayers that drifted past curfew. Some in the town called him a shepherd, others whispered of manipulation, of salvation offered with one hand while the other concealed something far more sinister. Asterisk Reverend Mercer, offering salvation or damnation. The narration fades beneath fragmented footage of church services children seated in neat rows, their expressions unreadable, the hymnals clutched like lifelines as Mercer's voice thunders with promises of redemption and veiled warnings of consequence. Newspaper clippings flash by in static bursts, headlines half-faded. Phrases like unusual practices and concerns raised over religious rites barely legible. Beneath the yellowed, brittle paper, the images fracture, once more faces lost in time, reputations tangled in half-truth sand through it all. The hollow silhouette of Bellevue rises again, waiting, watching. Its walls heavy with secrets that refuse to stay buried. The fog settled, thick over the grounds of Bellevue like an omen. It would roll in from the sea without warning, swallowing the orphanage in a damp, ghostly shroud that lingered long after sunrise. The lanterns lining the gravel paths flickered feebly against the creeping mist, their dim orange glow barely penetrating the gloom that coiled around the isolated dormitories. By day, Bellevue's stone walls seemed weathered but stable by night. They blurred into the darkness, jagged silhouettes against the endless, fog-drenched pines. It was in those early, unsettling months of 1977 that the whispers began. It started small, unnoticed by most. Scratches appeared on the trees at the edge of the property crude, jagged symbols that no one could identify. At first, the staff dismissed them as childish graffiti or the work of vandals from town, but the marks multiplied overnight, spreading deeper into the forest, curling along the bark like ancient runes carved by unseen hands. They twisted in ways that defied reason, circles within circles, lines that seemed to shift shape when viewed at different angles. The older girls whispered among themselves, passing rumors like currency beneath the cold stare of Headmistress Harrow. The animals came next. It was the groundskeeper, Thomas Pike, who first stumbled upon the remains of Fox, gutted and left. On the chapel steps, days later, a crow was found, nailed to the boundary fence, its wings grotesquely splayed, eyes plucked clean. Pike, a man already weighed down by suspicion, said little, only burying the evidence beneath the rotting soil and tightening the patrols around the orphanage grounds. But the mutilations continued: rabbits, birds, feral cattle left in ritualistic patterns, each scene more disturbing than the last. The local police were called, their reports cold and clinical. Animal remains discovered, possible acts of vandalism, investigation pending. But there were no arrests, no explanations, and the air around Bellview grew heavier, taut, with quiet dread. Inside the dormitories, the younger girls began to speak of voices. They claimed to hear whispers threading through the cracks in the walls at night, faint, unintelligible at first, but growing clearer with each passing week. Some spoke of their names being called from the shadows, others of hearing soft weeping echoing beneath the floorboards. One girl, barely 10, woke screaming that hands had reached for her from beneath her bed, thin, skeletal fingers scraping across the floor. Her accusations were met with scorn from the headmistress, who dismissed the incidents as hysteria fueled by childish cryogenitions and the stormy isolation of coastal Maine. But the incidents escalated. Doors slammed on their own, lanterns shattered, with no cause. A heavy, sickly smell like damp earth and decayed into the halls late at night. The girls began to sleep in pairs, too afraid to close their eyes alone. The distorted, warbled laughter of children, laughter that didn't belong to anyone in the orphanage, would drift through the corridors after curfew, fading into the floorboards before anyone could trace its source. Reverend Mercer, already a constant presence at Bellevue, leaned into these fears. His sermons turned darker, more urgent, filled with fire and brimstone. He spoke of evil that walked unseen, of corruption taking root in the hearts of the vulnerable. Some of the older staff whispered that Mercer spent too many late nights wandering the grounds with Pike, their flashlights bobbing beyond the chapel long after midnight, their voices hushed and tense. The younger girls were kept indoors, told to pray harder, to confess more, to believe that faith alone could keep the creeping darkness at bay. But belief offered little comfort when the walls themselves seemed to breathe. Police records from those months show a slow trickle of reports: the mutilated animals, the disturbed children, complaints from nearby townsfolk about strange chanting heard drifting from the orphanage grounds on fog-heavy nights. Each report stamped with the same conclusion: unsubstantiated rumors, nothing concrete, no evidence of criminal activity, just folklore, paranoia, and the fragile nerves of a forgotten corner of the state. Yet beneath those official reports, the tension swelled, staff turnover increased. Teachers and aides cited unease, illness, unexplained headaches. Some claimed to see figures watching from the tree line, vanishing when approached. Thomas Pike was seen more frequently near the forest's edge, sometimes whispering to himself, his eyes hollow, face pale beneath the flickering lantern light. Headmistress Harrow grew more severe, her punishments harsher, her public presence colder, her rigid discipline masked cracks beneath the surface, her hands trembling during roll call. her eyes darting toward the shadows as though expecting them to reach for her next. The news broke like a thunderclap over the small coastal towns of Miena. Terse radio bulletin crackling through static, announcing that 22 girls had vanished from Bellview Orphanage overnight. No witnesses, no bodies, no answers. By morning, the sleepy fishing villages surrounding Bellevue were alight with fear, suspicion, and the creeping realization that something unimaginable had occurred right in their backyard. Television screens flickered to life in diners, living rooms, and bait shops across the raging grainy 1970s. News anchors solemnly reporting from the windswept cliffs near the orphanage, their words heavy with unease. Helicopters buzzed overhead, their cameras capturing the decaying stone facade of Bellevue, framed by towering pines and the endless grey sea beyond. The building stood as a grim monument to what had transpired, a sanctuary turned spectacle. The reaction from the townspeople was immediate and volatile. Angry crowds gathered outside the orphanage gates within hours, clutching handmade signs scrawled with demands for answers. Parents pulled their children from nearby schools. Shopkeepers boarded their windows, and whispers rippled through every street corner, every church pew, every fog-choked alleyway. Bellevue, already an institution shrouded in suspicion, had become ground zero for panic. Rumors ignited like wildfire, fueled by the lack of evidence and the eerie history that clung to the orphanage like mold. Some claimed the girls had simply run away, though few believed 22 children could vanish without a trace. Others whispered of human trafficking rings, of dark figures seen lurking near the docks late at night. But the most unsettling theories traced their roots to something older, more ancient, something woven into the very bones of the town. The tabloids arrived within days, their headlines bold, lurid, and dripping with hysteria. Asterisk ritual cult at Bellevue, screamed one, splashed across grainy photos of the orphanage's crumbling walls. Another, more sensational, declared, 22 souls missing, satanic panic grips coastal Maine. Beneath the headlines, wild speculation spiraled claims of blood rituals. Pagan symbols etched into the trees, ghost sightings, and whispers of an old, malevolent force awakening in the forest. Local authorities, unprepared for such an unprecedented event, found themselves overwhelmed. Sheriff David Rourke, a grizzled, no-nonsense officer with decades on the force, faced an impossible task maintaining order amidst growing hysteria while grappling with the unsettling lack of evidence. Search parties combed the dense woods, surrounding Bellevue for weeks, their flashlights cutting through the mist. Dogs sniffing the undergrowth, volunteers calling out the girls' names until their voices cracked with desperation. But the forest gave nothing back. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, no signs of a struggle. Just silence, and the ever-present fog curling through the trees like ghostly fingers. Inside town halls and church basements, community meetings turned heated. Parents wept openly, accusing the orphanage staff of negligence or worse. Town elders spoke in hushed tones of Bellevue's cursed history, of the land's reputation long before the orphanage was built, reputation steeped in shipwrecks, disappearances, and strange symbols carved into the rocks by forgotten hands. Reverend Caleb Mercer, already a divisive figure, seized the pulpit to frame the event as a spiritual battle, warning of evil forces at work, of darkness that walked unseen among them. For many, those sermons fanned the flames of fear. The lines between faith, folklore, and outright paranoia blurred, leaving the community on edge, fractured. and desperate for explanations. Some townspeople turned on each other, accusing neighbors of occult involvement or harboring sinister secrets. Others spoke of hearing faint singing drifting from the cliffs at night, melodies that matched no known hymn, carried on the wind like a warning. The press, ravenous for every shred of speculation, camped outside the orphanage, their cameras rolling as investigators came and went, as the remaining staff, tight-lipped and visibly shaken, refused to answer questions. Headmistress Evelyn Harrow, once feared for her strict authority, appeared haggard, her expression hollow beneath the scrutiny of flashing bulbs. Her vague, contradictory statements only deepened suspicion, as did the sudden disappearance of Thomas Pike, the groundskeeper. He was last seen near the edge of the forest, days after the girls vanished, his cabin abandoned, his belongings hastily packed, his whereabouts unknown. The search for Pike became its own spectacle, with bounty hunters, amateur detectives, and conspiracy theorists descending on the area. Some claimed he fled in guilt, others believed he had been silenced by whatever force had taken the children. As weeks turned to months, the case evolved from tragedy to obsession. National networks picked up the story, late-night talk shows speculated wildly, and Bellview became etched into the American consciousness as a place of unsolved horror. Behind the headlines and public outcry, quieter, more unsettling discoveries emerged. Investigators found animal bones arranged in ritualistic patterns deep within the forest remnants, eerily similar to those reported months prior. Strange symbols, identical to those etched into trees near the orphanage, appeared carved into seaside cliffs, hidden caves, and weathered gravestones dating back centuries. The pattern suggested something coordinated, deliberate, and unnervingly bold. For some, these discoveries fed the belief that the disappearances were not the result of human action, but rather an ancient force tied to the land itself, something that had waited, patient and unseen, beneath the waves and soil. Elders in the community recalled stories passed down through generations of shipwrecked sailors lost to the cliffs, of ghostly lights flickering in the woods, of entire families who vanished without explanation, their homes left to rot beneath the creeping moss. Despite growing pressure, no arrests were made. The investigation stretched on, tangled in dead ends and conflicting testimonies. With every passing day, the odds of finding the girls alive dwindled, replaced by theories far darker than anyone wanted to entertain aloud. The term Bellview Orphanage became synonymous with mystery, fear, and unanswered questions, a cautionary tale whispered across New England in the absence of closure. The community fractured. Some moved away entirely, unwilling to raise their children in a place tainted by such loss. Others clung to faith, to folklore, to conspiracy theories that offered the illusion of understanding in the face of the inexplicable. But beneath it, all beneath the anger, the fear, the desperate search for answers, lingered the gnawing possibility that the girls of Bellview had not been taken by man, but by something older, something woven into the jagged cliffs, the restless sea, and the whispering pines of coastal Maine. The fog never truly lifted after that night, and neither did the sense that somewhere out there in the endless mist, the shadowed woods, the forgotten ruins, the truth still waited, watching, and far more terrifying than anyone dared to believe. 2 weeks after the disappearance, with panic suffocating the town and search efforts growing increasingly desperate, the first tangible clue emerged from the suffocating fog of uncertainty. The discovery came on a damp, overcast morning, when a volunteer search party combed the dense forest beyond Bellevue's grounds. Mud clung to their boots, Branches clawed at their jackets, and the ever-present mist curled low across the forest, floor like a living thing. For days, the search had yielded nothing. No tracks, no discarded belongings, no signs of a struggle. Just silence and the creeping suspicion that they were searching for ghosts. But that morning, deep within the tangled woods, near a crumbling outcrop of granite hidden beneath layers of moss and lichen, they found it. A crude symbol had been carved into the face of the stone. Jagged, angular, unnerving in its simplicity. The mark resembled the strange patterns etched into the trees around Bellview in the weeks leading up to the vanishing. But this one was different, larger, more deliberate, as though it had been placed there with purpose. The lines were deep, gouged into the rock with force. The edges rough and raw, as if scratched by something ancient and unrefined. The volunteers exchanged uneasy glances, their breaths clouding in the cold morning air, the woods falling eerily silent around them. Just below the symbol, tangled in a patch of brambles, one of the searchers spotted a ribbon, frayed at the edges, faintly pink beneath a coating of dried mud, and stained with something far darker, blood. The discovery sent shockwaves through the already fractured investigation. Within hours, the area was cordoned off by local police, their vehicles lining the remote access road as officers pushed through the undergrowth, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion and unease. Search dogs paced anxiously, noses to the ground. But the scent trail faded quickly, lost to rain and time. Forensics teams descended on the site, cameras flashing as they documented every detail: the symbol, the ribbon, the surrounding soil, disturbed by what could have been footprints, though too faint to be conclusive. Photographs captured the grim tableau, the carved mark stark against the grey stone, the blood-stained ribbon fluttering weakly in the wind like a final frayed fragment. Of the girls now swallowed by the forest, the news broke within hours, reigniting media frenzy. The footage of officers examining the site, of search dogs weaving through the mist, of grim-faced experts analyzing the blood-stained ribbon, saturated television broadcasts and front pages alike. Speculation exploded. Theorists dissected the symbol, drawing comparisons to ancient Norse runes, occult markings, even local folklore about maritime disappearances and ghost ships. The tabloid headlines returned with renewed vigor. Asterisk proof of ritual sacrifice. Cult symbol found. In Bellview Woods. Blood in the pines, first sign of the missing 22. Asterisk the local authorities, already overwhelmed and scrambling to maintain credibility, offered little in the way of answers. Sheriff Rourke held a tense press conference, his expression grim, his words carefully chosen. Asterisk, we have found an item linked to one of the missing girls, and markings that suggest deliberate human activity. We cannot confirm foul play at this time, but all leads are being pursued. His attempts at reassurance fell flat. The blood, the ominous symbol, the history of strange occurrences surrounding Bellview, it all painted a picture far darker than official statements could contain. The community, raw with grief and fear, reacted with predictably volatile emotion. Some saw the discovery as proof of their worst nightmares, cult operating in the shadows, preying on the most vulnerable. Others clung to hope, however fragile, that the blood was not fatal, that the ribbon was a planted diversion rather than confirmation of a far more tragic fate. Religious leaders called for prayer vigils. Amateur detectives flocked to the area, filming shaky footage of the woods, interviewing locals, feeding the spiraling vortex of rumor and dread. Behind closed doors, investigators pored over the evidence. Forensics confirmed the blood type matched. that of one of the younger missing girls, noon-rolled Clara Whitlow, a quiet child, known for her pink hair ribbons, her timid nature, and her close bond with the other orphans. Her absence, now underscored by the bloodied remnant found in the woods, struck a chord of deep sorrow and cold terror within the community. But the most unsettling revelation came from experts examining the symbol itself. Linguists and historians, brought in from nearby universities, struggled to classify it. Though it echoed certain Nordic runes and archaic maritime carvings found along Maine's treacherous coastline, it did not match any known language or symbol catalogued by modern scholars. Some speculated it was an invented sigil crafted by whoever orchestrated the girl's disappearance as part of an elaborate, sinister ritual. Others suggested it predated European settlement entirely, possibly tied to indigenous legends, long since warped by colonial retelllings. As the investigation dragged on, one chilling detail emerged: similar symbols had been reported near the cliffs and forests surrounding Bellview for over a century. Faded carvings etched into shipwreck debris, hidden inside abandoned fishing shacks, and even found on weathered gravestones deep within forgotten cemeteries. The implications unsettled even the most skeptical officers. This wasn't a recent invention or mere teenage mischief. It was older, persistent, and now seemingly active again. The discovery marked a turning point. Public fear hardened into something more primal, collective belief that the girls weren't merely missing, but entangled in something ancient, deliberate, and profoundly dangerous. The search efforts intensified, but so did the paranoia. Bellevue's history was dredged up in every conversation, its decaying walls and abandoned halls now seen not as relics of neglect, but as possible altars to something far more sinister. The forest, once a place of community hikes and local folklore, became a forbidden expanse, parents warning their children to stay away, even as amateur thrill-seekers dared each other deeper into its fog-bound depths. And all the while, the symbol on the stone remained a mute, unsettling reminder that the girls were still missing, the truth still hidden, and the darkness far from finished. Bellview Orphanage rose from the jagged cliffs of coastal Maine. In 1883, its weathered stone walls and Gothic architecture standing stark against the endless grey horizon of the Atlantic. Officially, it was founded as a sanctuary, a place of charity, of mercy for abandoned children left adrift by poverty, disease, and the unforgiving realities of 19th century life. But beneath the public facade of benevolence, Bellevue's history, like the cliffs it clung to, was fractured, treacherous, and steeped in shadow. Faded photographs from the era reveal stiff-faced orphans lined up in threadbare uniforms, their expressions wary beneath the cold stare of benefactors and clergy. Behind them, Bellevue loomed, its peaked roofs sharp against the fog, its windows dark as though watching silently over the children and the sea. The orphanage was constructed on land long regarded with suspicion by the locals, rocky terrain once used by fishermen and rumored to be a place the indigenous peoples of the region avoided, calling it the drowned ground, where spirits were said to linger, restless and vengeful. Historical maps, their edges browned and curling with age, show Bellevue's isolated position perched on the bluffs, bordered by dense forest, the nearest village a scattering of salt-stained cottages along the harbor. At first glance, its location seemed intended for peace, solitude, a sanctuary away from the crowded, disease-ridden cities. But as the years passed, whispers of Bellevue's true purpose began to stir. Old journals, police records, and fragmented town meeting notes hint at rituals and superstitions embedded deep within. Bellevue's foundations older than the orphanage itself, absorbed from coastal folklore and maritime legend. Among them was the Foundlings Festival, an obscure celebration held annually for decades, ostensibly to honor the orphaned children taken in by the institution. But beneath the parades and church services, villagers spoke of stranger rites, performed in private rituals involving offerings to the sea, cryptic songs sung at the cliffs, and tokens of the lost cast into the waves as blessings. The sea's blessing was one such tradition described in faded, brittle church records as an old ceremony meant to appease the tides and guard the innocent from the deep, while presented as a harmless vestige of sailor superstition, deeper investigation reveals troubling accounts mentions of symbolic sacrifices, of animals offered to the sea, of whispered prayers invoking those beneath the waves. Over time, these rites were dismissed as outdated relics of a more superstitious era, but the older generations remembered the stories, the shipwrecks blamed on angered spirits, the fishermen who vanished beneath calm seas, the children warned never to wander too close to the cliffs after dark. Bellevue's founder, a wealthy philanthropist named Silas Harrow, was known publicly for his generous endowments and Christian charity, but his private writings, portions of which survive in weathered town archives, paint a more complex, unsettling picture. He wrote of the thin place, describing Bellevue's coastal grounds as a site where the veil between this world and the other frays like worn cloth. His letters hint at a belief that the orphanage served not just the living, but also as a barrier against ancient tides and the hungering dark that waits beyond. Throughout the late 1800s and early 20th century, Bellevue was a fixture of the region, its children appearing at town fairs, church events, and festivals, though always with an air of distance, as if set apart by more than circumstance. The locals, dependent on the sea, yet fearful of its depths, often treated the orphanage as both a necessary charity and an uncomfortable relic of older, stranger customs. Even as the 20th century progressed and the more overt rituals faded, replaced by modern governance and oversight, traces of the old ways lingered etched into stones near the cliffs, carved into the wooden beams of Bellevue's chapel, whispered in the lullabies passed down through the orphanage's generations. When the 1977 disappearance occurred, those fragments of forgotten tradition were thrust back into the light, the town forced to reckon not just with tragedy, but with the possibility that their past obscured by time and denial was far darker, far older, and far less dormant than they had dared believe. The investigation into the disappearance of the 22 girls from Bellview Orphanage began with urgency, but quickly unraveled into a labyrinth of dead ends, conflicting accounts, and an overwhelming sense of futility. From the moment authorities arrived on the fog-bound cliffs that housed the decaying orphanage, the case felt heavier than a standard missing persons report. The building itself loomed over the search team's crumbling stone walls damp with sea spray, its windows shattered and gaping like hollow eyes. The air reeked of mildew, salt, and something else, an unshakable feeling that whatever had taken place within those walls had left a scar deeper than anyone could immediately see. Detectives, uniformed officers, and forensic teams flooded the area, their faces tight with exhaustion and disbelief. Press conferences were hastily organized, with Sheriff David Rourke standing rigid beneath harsh camera lights, his voice clipped and cautious as he assured the community that every resource is being utilized, and that the safety of our children remains our top priority. Yet behind the stoic facade, the reality was far more disjointed. From the outset, the investigation faltered, strangled by a lack of evidence, unreliable witnesses, and the suffocating atmosphere of fear that clouded both the community and the authorities alike. Theories swirled like the ever-present fog that clung to the coastline. Abduction was the immediate assumption, a coordinated kidnapping, perhaps by an outside group exploiting the orphanage's isolation. Yet the logistics of such an operation baffled investigators. How could 22 girls, ranging in age from 7 to 15, vanish simultaneously without a single scream, struggle, or eyewitness account? The grounds showed no signs of forced entry, no tire tracks, no fingerprints, no broken locks. The dormitories were eerily undisturbed beds, neatly made, belongings untouched, the faintest trace of warmth lingering in the abandoned rooms, as if the girls had simply ceased to exist. The occult theory took root quickly, stoked by the strange symbols carved into the surrounding forest. The ritualistic animal mutilations reported in the weeks prior, and the area's dark folklore. News outlets sensationalized every cryptic detail, rumors of pagan ceremonies, ghost sightings, and satanic cults operating under the guise of charity. The tabloids declared Bellevue a nexus of dark energy, their pages splashed with ominous headlines and speculative diagrams linking the missing girls to esoteric symbols and long-forgotten maritime legends. Surviving investigators, speaking in fragmented, grainy interviews years later, recalled the frustration and dread that bled into every aspect of the case. One retired detective, his face lined with age, recounted the suffocating atmosphere of Bellevue's grounds, the fog so dense it muted sound, the sensation of being watched from the tree line, the unease that crept into their bones as they searched the decaying hallways and overgrown paths. It felt wrong out there, he admitted, voice low, eyes darting away from the camera. Like the ground itself didn't want us finding anything. Evidence collection proved maddeningly inconclusive. Aside from the blood-stained ribbon discovered, weeks into the investigation, no physical trace of the girls emerged. No footprints, no hair, no fibers. Their personal belongings remained neatly in place, untouched as though they had vanished mid-step, mid-breath. Forensic teams combed the area with increasing desperation, but every lead dissolved into mist, quite literally fading beneath the unrelenting coastal fog and shifting terrain. Attention inevitably turned inward to the orphanage staff. Headmistress Evelyn Harrow became a focal point, her stern demeanor and evasive interviews painting her as either overwhelmed or complicit. Her records, scrutinized by detectives and the media alike, revealed decades of rigid discipline, harsh punishments, and an unyielding control over Bellevue's operations. Some believed she knew more than she let on, her trembling hands and distant gaze betraying secrets kept hidden beneath layers of duty and fear. Thomas Pike, the groundskeeper, emerged as an even more unsettling figure. His abrupt disappearance, days after the incident, fueled theories of guilt, yet his cabin, searched thoroughly by police, contained little beyond personal effects, maintenance tools, and cryptic scribblings of symbols that mirrored those found carved into the trees. His vanishing act became another puzzle piece in a case defined by fragmentations. Some believed he fled in fear. Others were certain he was silenced, or worse, that he had succumbed to whatever darkness had swallowed the girls. Reverend Caleb Mercer, too, drew scrutiny. His sermons, increasingly apocalyptic in the months leading up to the disappearances, were dissected for hidden meanings. His late-night presence at Bellevue, his fascination with the orphanage's spiritual vulnerabilities, and his fiery, Warnings of evil festering beneath the surface all became fuel for public suspicion. Yet Mercer, defiant beneath questioning, denied involvement, framing the tragedy as proof of divine warfare rather than human crime. Search operations expanded beyond the orphanage grounds. Dive teams scoured the rocky coves and sea caves below, the cliffs battling treacherous currents and limited visibility. Search parties pushed deeper into the forest, their flashlights slicing through fog-like blades, their radios crackling with false leads and rising frustration. Helicopters swept the coastline, thermal imaging equipment deployed, yet the vast, jagged wilderness offered no answers, only silence, and the occasional whisper of wind through pines. Privately, investigators admitted to a creeping hopelessness. Case files ballooned with witness statements, conflicting timelines, and maps marked with fruitless search grids. Police sketches of potential suspects, based on vague, contradictory sightings, circulated briefly before fading into irrelevance. Every promising lead, every piece of potential evidence ultimately evaporated, leaving behind only questions as months turned to years. The official investigation stagnated. Public pressure waned, media attention drifted elsewhere, and Bellview Orphanage, its reputation irreparably tarnished, was shuttered and left to decay, its stone walls surrendered to ivy and time. Yet for the investigators who walked those grounds, who traced those symbols, who stood beneath the hollow windows of that building, the memory of the case lingered a gnawing, unfinished weight. Even decades later, grainy footage of the search operations resurfaces in documentaries and amateur investigations, a haunting collage of haggard detectives flipping through files, police dogs pacing the muddy forest, volunteers silhouetted against the mist as they call out names that would never be answered. The prevailing theory: no single explanation sufficed. Perhaps it was abduction, perhaps a cult, perhaps an orchestrated cover-up buried beneath layers of small-town fear and silence, or, as some dared to suggest, perhaps it was something older, something beyond human comprehension, something bound to the cliffs, the fog, the sea, and the forgotten histories etched into stone long before Bellevue was built. Whatever the truth, one fact remains: the girls were never found, the case was never closed, and the mist that swallowed Bellevue has never fully lifted. In the weeks and months that followed the disappearance of the 22 girls from Bellview Orphanage, the small coastal towns of Maine became a breeding ground for chaos, speculation, and misinformation. The lack of concrete answers, coupled with the chilling details, the blood-stained ribbon, the strange symbols in the woods, the vanishing of Thomas Pike, created a perfect storm for rumors to thrive. Every whispered conversation, every shadow spotted in the fog, every half-remembered legend from the region's maritime past was pulled into the vortex of uncertainty, twisting fact and fiction into a narrative that no one could fully untangle. The newspapers fueled the confusion. Local headlines contradicted national reports. One article claimed witnesses had seen hooded figures moving through the trees near Bellevue on the night the girls vanished, silhouettes barely visible through the heavy mist. The next day, another paper dismissed the claims entirely, citing law enforcement statements that no such evidence had been found. Grainy black and white photographs showed blurred shapes among the pines, presented as proof by some, ridiculed as hoaxes by others. The accounts from townsfolk varied wildly. Some claimed to have heard chanting low, rhythmic voices drifting from the cliffs near the orphanage in the hours before the disappearance. Others spoke of strange lights moving through the forest, glowing orbs or flickering torches carried by unknown figures. but every story seemed to conflict with the next. The time frames didn't align, the details shifted, and those who came forward often contradicted themselves under scrutiny. The fog, ever present and disorienting, was blamed for the distorted memories, but beneath that explanation lurked something deeper: collective unease, a gnawing sense that the truth was slipping further away with each passing day. Television crews descended upon the area, their coverage only intensifying the confusion. National anchors reported dramatic, often sensationalized versions of events, cutting between shaky footage of search parties, tearful interviews with residents, and archival images of Bellevue's decaying walls. Fringe talk shows entertained outlandish theories: government experiments, alien abduction, portals to other worlds hidden in the forest. Mainstream networks cautiously danced around the possibility of cult involvement, careful not to incite outright panic, yet offering just enough suggestion to keep viewers glued to the screen. The media frenzy fractured the community further. Longtime neighbors turned on one another, accusations whispered over fences, in church pews, at grocery store counters. Some believed the orphanage staff had orchestrated the disappearance. Others were convinced Reverend Mercer's sermons had masked darker intentions. Old family feuds and buried grievances resurfaced, fueled by the suspicion that anyone among them might be hiding a terrible secret within the investigative ranks. Frustration mounted. Officers struggled to separate credible leads from the tidal wave of misinformation pouring in. Tip lines rang constantly, callers reporting sightings of the missing girls in distant cities, others claiming knowledge of secret ceremonies held in the woods, still more swearing they'd seen shadowy figures lurking near their homes. Every report required time, resources, and verification, yet nearly all of them led nowhere, evaporating as quickly as they had appeared. Some of the more bizarre rumors took on lives of their own. Tales spread of ancient maritime curses tied to Bellevue's location, of sea spirits demanding offerings, of disappearances linked to phases of the moon. Local bookstores saw a spike in occult literature sales, while self-proclaimed experts on folklore and the supernatural arrived from out of town, offering theories wrapped in pseudo-history and dramatic rhetoric. In the absence of solid evidence, the narrative became whatever the loudest voices decided it should be. The press leaned into the most sensational elements: the eerie symbols, the missing groundskeeper, the orphanage's shadowy past. Townsfolk clung to whatever explanation brought them the most comfort, even if it meant embracing stories that defied logic. Conflicting timelines, contradictory witness accounts, and the constant churn of media distortion created a fog of uncertainty as thick and impenetrable as the one that hung perpetually over the cliffs. Law enforcement's credibility eroded under the pressure. Public briefings devolved into contentious affairs, reporters demanding answers the detectives simply didn't have. Every new scrap of information, every conflicting testimony, only deepened the divide between the investigation and the terrified community. Those who questioned the official narrative were branded conspiracy theorists. Those who trusted the authorities were accused of being blind to the truth. And beneath the noise, the unanswered questions remained. How could 22 girls disappear without a trace? Who carved the symbols in the forest? Why had Pike vanished? What did the headmistress truly know? Was Reverend Mercer a misguided preacher or something more sinister? The fog that blanketed the coastline mirrored the growing uncertainty: thick, disorienting, impossible to navigate. As the months dragged on, misinformation became more than A byproduct of fear, it became the dominant force shaping the investigation. Stories clashed, theories multiplied, and with every contradictory account, the truth drifted further out to sea, lost somewhere beyond the jagged cliffs and the whispering pines of Bellview. Years after the panic had faded, after the headlines had dulled and the press crews packed up their cameras, a quieter, more unsettling chapter of the Bellview mystery began to emerge. Forgotten voices, once silenced by fear, shame, or dismissal, surfaced from the shadows, their fragmented testimonies revealing cracks in the official narrative that had long been buried beneath the weight of confusion and misinformation. These were not bold declarations made before flashing cameras or police microphones. They came quietly blurred faces behind grainy hidden camera footage, distorted voices on late-night radio programs, anonymous letters slipped to journalists, each carrying fragments of a truth far darker than anyone had been prepared to confront. It began with former staff members, kitchen workers, janitors, individuals who had been at Bellview in the months leading up to the disappearances, but had either fled the town, been dismissed, or remained silent under the oppressive atmosphere that followed. Some came forward, under conditions of anonymity, their identities masked, their testimonies fractured by years of suppressed memories and gnawing guilt. But their stories, when pieced together, painted a chilling, consistent picture of life inside Bellview before that storm-lashed night in 1977. Former maid, her voice trembling beneath layers of audio distortion, recalled hearing whispers among the staff of ceremonies held late at night gatherings, disguised as prayer meetings, but marked by strange chanting, candlelight flickering behind closed doors, and the faint smell of burning herbs drifting through the orphanage halls. She spoke of the girls being chosen, certain ones marked for blessings that required isolation, strange symbols drawn on their belongings, and long, unexplained absences during which the other children were instructed to remain silent. Another, a former groundskeeper's assistant, admitted to seeing carvings etched into the stones near the cliff symbols, identical to those discovered during the investigation, but dismissed at the time as local graffiti or maritime folklore. He described being warned by Thomas Pike to mind his place and not go digging where the roots run deep, cryptic phrases that, at the time, he brushed off as the ramblings of an old man, but which now reverberated with a new, sinister clarity. An anonymous letter sent to a regional newspaper years after the case had gone cold outlined even darker claims. The author, identifying themselves only as a child of Bellview, wrote of waking to find symbols scrawled on the walls of the dormitories, of being led into the chapel for secret rituals masked as evening prayers. The letter hinted at offerings made to the sea beneath the stones, and of Headmistress Harrow speaking in hushed tones of protecting the orphanage from ancient tides that demanded innocent souls in return for safety. Investigative journalists, chasing these whispers, managed to secure hidden camera interviews with aging townsfolk, individuals who, though never directly connected to Bellview, carried second-hand knowledge of the orphanage's secrets. One elderly man, his face shadowed, voice cracked by time, recounted stories passed down by fishermen, tales of lights seen near the cliffs, of chanting carried over the water, of entire catches vanishing overnight, blamed on angered spirits that demanded sacrifice. Another source, a woman whose sister had once worked at Bellview, spoke of foundlings chosen for the old ways, implying that certain orphans were marked from the moment they arrived, selected not by fate, but by design. Perhaps most disturbing were the fragments that connected Reverend Mercer and Thomas Pike to these clandestine rituals. Multiple testimonies suggested that Pike had been more than just a reclusive groundskeeper, that his role extended beyond maintenance, that he acted as a kind of caretaker for the old traditions, rooted in the cliffs and forests long before Bellevue's stone walls were ever raised. Some claimed Pike had been raised on local legends, taught the songs of the sea and the sigils of protection, passed down through generations of coastal families who believed the land itself demanded appeasement. Reverend Mercer, though outwardly a man of faith, was implicated in whispers of blending Christian doctrine with older pagan rites, his fire and brimstone sermons masking references to ancient hungers and curses that walk among us. His obsession with Bellevue, his frequent nocturnal visits, and his warnings of spiritual battles took on new, unsettling meanings through the lens of these overlooked testimonies. Yet despite these chilling revelations, none of the hidden witnesses possessed tangible proof. No photographs, no official records, only fragmented memories, cryptic warnings, and half-remembered ceremonies blurred by time and fear. Law enforcement, long weary of the case, dismissed the claims as unverifiable hearsay. But for those who still sought the truth, the forgotten voices painted a pattern impossible to ignore, a web of rituals, secrecy, and manipulation stretching back decades, perhaps longer. The emerging testimonies hinted at a system designed to mask the disappearances, not merely through human cover-ups, but through a culture of fear, superstition, and tradition buried beneath generations of coastal life. And as more voices fragmented, distorted, anonymous continued to emerge, one reality became inescapable. The tragedy of Bellview Orphanage had roots far deeper than anyone imagined. Roots tangled in rituals older than the town itself, and secrets that many had tried and failed to keep buried beneath the fog and stone. In the dimly lit evidence room of the Coastal Sheriff's Department, the sealed boxes sat stacked and gathering dust, marked with peeling labels and faded case. Numbers that, to outsiders, meant nothing. But inside, sealed away from public scrutiny, fragments of the dark tapestry that Bellview Orphanage had woven into the very soil of the town. For years, these items had been tucked into storage, dismissed as inconclusive, irrelevant, or too disturbing to present openly during the fractured investigation. Yet, when viewed together, they told a story far more chilling than any official report dared to acknowledge, a story of ancient symbols, ritualistic blood rites, and forgotten warnings buried by those entrusted to protect the most vulnerable. The first box, retrieved reluctantly by a retired detective long after the case had gone cold, contained sketches, hundreds of them. Most were crude, drawn in charcoal or pencil on scraps of paper torn from notebooks, hymnals, and discarded schoolwork. But the patterns were unmistakable, circles interlocked with jagged, angular runes that echoed the symbol carved into the forest stone weeks after the girls vanished. Some depicted swirling waves consuming figures beneath them. Others showed the cliffs behind Bellevue crumbling into an abyss, faceless shapes watching from within the mist. The drawings were unsigned, anonymous, yet their childlike quality suggested they originated from the orphans themselves, expressions of fear and knowledge they should never have possessed. Alongside the sketches were journals dugid, water-damaged, pages stained with age, but still legible enough to unravel unsettling details. One journal, belonging to a girl identified only as E.W., presumably one of the older orphans, chronicled weeks of strange occurrences leading up to the mass disappearance. Her handwriting, uneven yet urgent, described marks appearing on the walls and singing in the chapel after midnight, songs with words none of the children recognized, taught in whispers by staff members under the guise of tradition. Another entry revealed more sinister undertones. E.W. wrote of girls being selected by Headmistress Harrow and Reverend Mercer for private lessons held in the orphanage's chapel. Lessons that involved drawing the sea's blessing on their skin with what she described as red ink that smelled like rust. Forensic analysis later revealed faint traces of dried blood embedded in the fibers of confiscated handkerchiefs and cloth scraps recovered from the dormitory's blood that, when tested, matched the profiles of the missing girls. More chilling still were the confiscated objects hidden away in the evidence files, fragments of driftwood carved with runes similar to those in the forest, seashells stained in unnatural black, and bundles of animal bones arranged in deliberate, ritualistic patterns. Each artifact, dismissed as local superstition or adolescent mischief at the time, fits seamlessly into the larger, more sinister framework painted by the hidden testimonies and overlooked evidence. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a locked metal box recovered from Thomas Pike's abandoned cabin. Inside were weathered photographs dating back to the early 1900s, images of Bellview children lined up on the cliffs. Identical symbols scrawled onto their clothing, faint, shadowy figures, barely visible in the background, half obscured by the mist. One photograph in particular drew immediate scrutiny. 22 girls, dressed in outdated uniforms, faces solemn, standing beside Reverend Mercer's predecessor, a man whose eyes appeared scratched out deliberately, his hands resting on the shoulders of the children. Investigators initially dismissed the photograph as unrelated, a relic from Belleview's long history. But handwriting scrawled on the back of the image read, asterisk, they were taken to watch the waves. A chilling coincidence, or proof of a recurring, generational pattern hidden in plain sight. Some within law enforcement believed the latter, though officially the file was sealed. The implications deemed too speculative for public record. Tucked beneath these artifacts were transcripts of anonymous phone calls received by the department in the weeks following the disappearance. The voice, distorted and trembling, warned of the old ways returning, of sacrifices demanded by the sea beneath the cliffs, and of symbols drawn not as decoration, but as marks of protection and ownership. The calls were traced. 2 payphones scattered across neighboring towns. The speaker never identified. Their warnings buried under the mounting hysteria of the case. Blood-stained altar cloths, hidden beneath the floorboards of Belleview's chapel, provided further grim context. Though authorities initially suspected vandalism or a macabre prank, closer examination revealed intricate stitching along the edge symbols identical to those found in the forest, intertwined with cryptic phrases in archaic English and fragments of Latin prayers warped into unfamiliar verses. Experts consulted by the department noted the symbols' unsettling alignment with both nautical folklore and obscure pagan rituals, designed to appease forces dwelling beneath the waves. Despite these mounting details, the official investigation stagnated. Fear of igniting widespread panic or drawing unwanted attention to the town's darker history led to key evidence being quietly archived, dismissed, or lost among bureaucracy. Yet for those who dared to sift through the forgotten files, the narrative was impossible to ignore. Bellview Orphanage was never simply a place of refuge for abandoned children. It was a vessel rooted in coastal superstition, wrapped in rituals older than any official charter, shaped by the belief that the land demanded sacrifice to stave off a darker fate in the cold, silent evidence room the sealed boxes remained, holding within them the fragmented warnings left behind by the missing girls, their sketches, their journals, their blood-stained belongings, woven into a narrative obscured by fog, silence, and a history few were willing to confront. And as the decades passed, those chilling details continued to whisper from the shadows, reminding anyone who dared to look too closely that Bellevue's darkness had never truly been sealed away, merely hidden, waiting for the tides to turn. Once more, the symbols etched into the walls of Bellview Orphanage, carved into the trees surrounding the cliffs, and scrawled in the forgotten journals of its children, were more than idle scribbles or the product of overactive imaginations. They were fragments of something far older, far more deliberate, and woven into the fabric of the coastal town's darkest traditions. At first glance, they resembled maritime runes, the kind sailors etched onto ships to ward off misfortune or storms, symbols designed to appease the ever-hungry sea. But deeper examination revealed a far more esoteric and sinister origin, pointing to rituals long buried beneath layers of folklore, religious secrecy, and coastal superstition. Archival photographs of Bellevue's interior, taken during the investigation, revealed crude markings hidden beneath peeling wallpaper and faded paints, the same angular runes discovered on stones deep in the forest. Beneath the floorboards of the chapel, symbols were burned into the wooden beams, circles intersected with jagged lines, reminiscent of protection wards, but corrupted, distorted into something that seemed to repel rather than shield. These carvings matched diagrams found in forbidden grimoires, obscure texts whispered about in academic circles, their pages filled with warnings of rituals designed not to worship, but to bargain with entities said to dwell beneath the natural world, entities beyond comprehension, ancient and ravenous. Occult historians, consulted by curious investigators, noted unsettling similarities between Bellevue's symbols and markings associated with seafaring cults dating back to the early 19th century. These fringe groups, scattered across remote coastal communities from New England to Northern Europe, practiced rituals they claimed would ensure safe passage, bountiful fishing, or protection from the ocean's unpredictable fury. But the price of these rites, according to whispered accounts, was always the same sacrifice, chosen from the most vulnerable, often masked behind the guise of charity or religious tradition. The orphans of Bellevue, abandoned by society, became the perfect vessels for such beliefs. Anonymous letters, unearthed decades later, hinted at the existence of secret ceremonies within the orphanage rituals cloaked beneath Christian liturgy, blending scripture with older, far more primal invocations. These ceremonies involved the drawing of symbols on the children's belongings, the burning of incense laced with unfamiliar herbs, and cryptic recitations invoking the tides that hunger and the eyes beneath the waves. Journal fragments discovered hidden beneath dormitory mattresses spoke of markings appearing overnight and of girls chosen by the sea. Some of the missing children had confided in their peers, writing of dreams filled with cold salt water, shadowed figures watching from the cliffs, and whispered promises of a blessing for the greater good. These cryptic messages, dismissed as childish nightmares at the time, gained disturbing context when overlaid with the physical evidence of symbols burned, carved, and scrawled throughout Bellevue's grounds. Further complicating the mystery were the stone carvings found along the jagged cliffs surrounding the orphanage ruins, identical to those hidden within the building itself, their weathered lines suggesting they had been there far longer than Bellevue had stood. These markings were etched into the granite in patterns resembling tidal maps, pointing toward hidden coves and sea caves known only to locals. Some believed these locations were used for clandestine rituals, the waves masking whatever offerings were made, the rocky walls concealing secrets that no amount of police investigation could uncover. Occult diagrams recovered from hidden compartments within Bellevue's library revealed rituals disturbingly similar to those hinted at in folklore: the Sea's Blessing, a ceremony involving the selection of marked individuals, offerings of blood, and the drawing of specific symbols at key locations: the chapel, the cliffs, the forest, and beneath the dormitories. These diagrams contained phrases in archaic Latin and bastardized maritime dialects, referencing the ancient covenant, a pact made with the ocean or with beings beneath it, designed to bring prosperity to the land in exchange for periodic sacrifice. Survivors' testimonies, filtered through distortion and decades of silence, hinted at the rituals continuing long after public interest faded. Some claimed to have seen symbols freshly carved into trees near Bellevue, even years after the orphanage's closure, suggesting that the old traditions, though officially forbidden, were still practiced in the shadows by those who clung to the belief that only through appeasement could disaster be averted. The town's history, riddled with unexplained shipwrecks, mysterious disappearances, and patterns of tragedy striking every few decades, fed into the theory that the symbols were not relics of the past, but active warnings, ongoing markers of a ritualistic system woven into the coastal community's hidden culture. Whether these practices continued out of fear, devotion, or something darker remained uncertain. But the symbols left behind, etched into stone, whispered in journal pages, hidden beneath paint and plaster, served as constant reminders that Bellevue's darkness was not confined to history books. The esoteric language of these symbols, deciphered only partially by experts, pointed to a belief system that merged ancient seafaring superstition with occult rites of protection and sacrifice. And while the public narrative clung to rational theories of abduction, cult activity, tragic mismanagement, the markings within Bellevue's crumbling walls whispered of rituals never truly abandoned, cryptic messages left behind, not merely as warnings, but as blueprints for a tradition of fear that, perhaps, had never truly ended. In the aftermath of the Bellview Orphanage tragedy, as investigators combed through fading evidence and the community drowned in conflicting rumors, a quieter, clinical analysis began to surface, one rooted not in symbols or folklore, but in the human mind. Psychologists, cult experts, and sociologists were drawn to the case, their fascination less about the paranormal implications and more about the human susceptibility beneath it all, beneath the talk of rituals, symbols, and whispered ceremonies. They saw the perfect storm of isolation, vulnerability, and psychological conditioning, the kind of environment that cultivates obedience, dependency, and, ultimately, exploitation. Dr. Lorraine Carter, a leading psychologist specializing in institutional trauma, studied the Bellevue case extensively, calling it a textbook example of how isolation warps identity and leaves individuals, especially children, ripe for manipulation. In interviews conducted for later documentaries, she spoke candidly of the orphanage's psychological design. Bellevue wasn't just a building on the cliffs, it was a self-contained world, cut off by geography and circumstance, its inhabitants, shaped by abandonment, grief, and the desperate need for belonging. For the children inside, particularly those without family, the lines between care, control, and coercion were dangerously blurred. Dr. Carter explained that in such closed environments, Authority figures like Headmistress Evelyn Harrow or Reverend Caleb Mercer held absolute psychological power. In isolated, hierarchical settings, obedience becomes not just expected but necessary for survival. Children taught to rely on a rigid system, reinforced by punishment and the promise of protection, quickly lose the ability to question what they're told. When woven with fear, superstition, and religious doctrine, that obedience can be twisted into participation in rituals or beliefs that under normal circumstances would be unthinkable. Sociologists examining the community around Bellview saw similar patterns. Professor Simon Kearns, a sociologist specializing in rural group psychology, described the coastal town as suffering from generational isolation. The town's geography remote, battered by harsh weather, dependent on fishing, and superstition had created an insular culture resistant to outsiders and critical thought. In such environments, folklore and tradition often filled the void left by scientific reasoning, and fear of the unknown becomes a currency traded among the community. According to Kearns, this atmosphere made Bellview fertile ground for belief. In the esoteric, when a community relies on the sea for survival, he explained, they inherit its unpredictability, its danger, and its myths. The cliffs, the fog, the drownings, they all become part of a story passed down, framing unexplained events as supernatural inevitabilities rather than failures of human action. Within this framework, the orphanage became both sanctuary and sacrificial ground, a place where forgotten children were protected from the outside world. Yet at the mercy of the beliefs entrenched within their caregivers, cult experts drew even darker parallels. Dr. Mariah Denslow, an expert on coercive control and cult indoctrination, analyzed the Bellview testimonies and found eerie similarities to known cult structures. Isolation, an authoritarian leader, rituals designed to reinforce group identity, and a pervasive fear of the outside world. Though Bellview was officially a religious institution, Dr. Denslow argued that the lines between spiritual guidance and cultic manipulation had long since blurred, if they had ever existed at all. Denslow pointed to Reverend Mercer's increasingly apocalyptic sermons as evidence of escalating thought reform, where fear is used to destabilize personal autonomy. His warnings of ancient hungers and unseen forces created a climate where children and even staff believed they were part of a battle beyond human control. In such states, individuals become more malleable, more likely to accept irrational directives, and more willing to participate in rites framed as protective, even sacrificial. Necessities further fueling this manipulation was the orphanage's strict hierarchy. Survivors' accounts hinted at older children being given minor authority over the younger ones. Tactics seen frequently in cults to distribute control while reinforcing dependence. Those who obeyed were rewarded with perceived safety. Those who resisted were isolated or marked as unworthy. Feeding a self-policing system of conformity, psychologists examining the remaining sketches and journals from the orphanage noted classic symptoms of trauma-induced dissociation and suggestibility. The recurring imagery of waves, shadowed figures, and symbols suggested that the children internalized their environment's fears, transforming folklore and ritual into personal nightmares. The distinction between fantasy and reality became so eroded that when the disappearances occurred, many believed the girls had been taken by the sea or by entities beyond understanding, not by human action, but by the very forces instilled in them since their arrival. The experts agreed on one harrowing point: the psychological scars of Bellview ran deep not just for those within its walls, but for the community as a whole. Generational trauma, wrapped in silence and superstition, ensured that even after the orphanage's closure, the mechanisms of control and fear persisted. Parents warned their children about the cliffs, not with rational caution, but with whispered references to curses and lost souls. Townsfolk avoided discussing the orphanage's history, fostering a culture where questioning the past was taboo, and silence was survival. In this vacuum, conspiracy theories, ghost stories, and occult rumors thrived. But beneath the sensationalism, the psychological foundation was disturbingly clear. Isolation fosters obedience. Vulnerability invites exploitation. Fear sustains control. Bellview was less an outlier and more a tragic culmination of these truths, a place where abandoned children, desperate for safety, were instead ensnared in a web of belief, manipulation, and ritual that stripped them of agency long before they physically vanished. For experts like Dr. Carter and Dr. Denslow, the Bellview case remains a chilling reminder of how easily communities and, especially their most vulnerable members, can be shaped by isolation, fear, and authority unchecked. And while symbols and rituals may dominate the folklore, the deepest horror of Bellview lies in the quiet, methodical way obedience was cultivated, how trust was weaponized, and how human minds, particularly young, impressionable ones, can be led, step by step, into the shadows without ever realizing they've already disappeared, piece by piece. Investigators, journalists, and researchers have spent decades painstakingly reconstructing the final days, leading up to the vanishing of the 22 girls. From Bellview Orphanage, despite the fog of misinformation, the erased records, and the fractured testimonies, certain details, when arranged chronologically, paint a chilling and coherent picture of a community spiraling toward an unthinkable tragedy. It is a timeline marked by strange sightings, overlooked warnings, and a sequence of small, eerie events that, in hindsight, seem impossible to dismiss. It began in the late summer of 1977. Reports indicate that by August, the atmosphere at Bellview had shifted noticeably. Staff logs what little remains of them note an increase in behavioral issues among the girls, sleeplessness, complaints of nightmares, and what was referred to as hysteria among the younger residents. At the same time, townspeople began reporting unusual activity along the cliffs, the appearance of strange symbols carved into trees and stones, animals found mutilated along the forest's edge, and faint chanting heard at night, drifting over the waves. On August 19th, 2 weeks before the disappearances, the first official incident was recorded. A groundskeeper reported finding a crude stone altar deep in the woods, marked with blood and animal remains, though dismissed publicly as the work of vandals. Internal reports suggest authorities were already concerned about possible cult activity in the region. By August 23rd, sightings of strange lights along the cliffs became more frequent. Multiple witnesses, including local fishermen and hikers, described glowing orbs or torch-like lights moving in irregular patterns near the Bellview grounds. Some claimed to hear low, rhythmic chanting accompanying the lights, though no official confirmation was made at the time in the orphanage itself. Journals recovered from the dormitories describe increasing unease among the girls. Several entries reference the markings appearing inside the building, as well as private lessons conducted by Headmistress Harrow and Reverend Mercer sessions, said to be mandatory for select girls, often taking place late at night in the chapel or along the cliffs. On August 26th, a former staff member reported hearing a heated argument between Harrow and Mercer regarding the preparation and the C's demand. Though the details of this confrontation remain murky, it coincides with several girls being seen with symbols drawn on their belongings and, according to hidden testimonies, even on their skin. 2 days later, August 28th, townspeople recall a particularly intense storm rolling in from the sea, battering the coast with violent winds and heavy fog that lingered unnaturally for days. Fishermen reported strange disturbances in the water nets torn, catches vanishing, and eerie, deep sounds resonating from beneath the waves near the cliffs. On August 30th, only 2 days before the vanishing, Bellevue's official visitor log inexplicably goes blank. Records indicate no visitors, deliveries, or external communications documented for a 48-hour period. A sharp contrast to the otherwise routine notations of daily activity. Internal memos later recovered suggest staff members were instructed to suspend external contact for undisclosed reasons. The night of August 31st is considered the tipping point. Multiple townspeople claimed to witness an unusual procession of hooded figures moving along the cliffs near Bellevue, illuminated by faint, flickering lights. Some reports describe hearing low, guttural chanting and seeing what appeared to be children among the group, though fog obscured clear details. No official acknowledgement of these sightings was made at the time. September 1st, 1977. The day the girls disappeared began under heavy fog and an oppressive silence that locals described as unnatural. Staff arriving for morning duties at Bellevue discovered the dormitories empty, 22 beds neatly made, personal belongings untouched. No signs of struggle, forced entry, or disturbance. The girls aged 7 to 15 had simply vanished. Authorities were notified within hours, and an intensive search was launched across the cliffs, forests, and sea caves. Despite exhaustive efforts involving local police, volunteers, and later, state resources, no trace of the girls was ever found, no footprints, no physical evidence beyond the already documented symbols and one blood-stained ribbon discovered. Days later, deep in the forest, in the immediate aftermath, additional peculiarities came to light. Records from Bellevue's administrative office were found incomplete, with entire sections of staff logs, correspondence, and internal reports missing or destroyed. Witnesses recalled seeing Reverend Mercer leaving the orphanage grounds early. That morning, his clothes damp and his expression described as haunted. Mercer later denied any knowledge of the events, though his sermons in the following weeks took on an increasingly apocalyptic tone before his own. Disappearance under mysterious circumstances. Thomas Pike, the elusive groundskeeper, vanished on September 3rd, leaving behind his belongings, maintenance tools, and a hidden collection of photographs and symbols eerily similar to those found within the orphanage and the forest. His disappearance remains unexplained to this day. In the days following the vanishing, strange occurrences continued to plague the aerialites seen along the cliffs, symbols appearing overnight carved into trees, and unsettling reports of shadowy figures watching from the forest's edge. These incidents slowly subsided, though the fog lingered longer than usual that season, fueling whispers that whatever had happened at Bellevue was far from over. The reconstructed timeline remains incomplete, fragmented by missing records, conflicting testimonies, and the corrosive effects of fear and secrecy. Yet the sequence of events, from strange symbols and hidden rituals to the vanishing and the eerie aftermath, suggests a carefully orchestrated pattern rather than random tragedy. The final days of Bellview Orphanage were marked by escalating signs that, in hindsight, point to preparation, manipulation, and an ancient concealed ritual playing out beneath the surface of official reports. To this day, the timeline stands as both a map of missed warnings and a chilling testament to how, piece by piece, the ordinary can spiral into the extraordinary and 22 innocent lives can vanish into the fog, leaving only unanswered questions behind. Decades have passed since the 22 girls vanished from Bellview Orphanage, yet the land itself seems unable to forget. The once formidable stone structure, perched on the windswept cliffs of coastal Maine, now lies in ruin, a decaying skeleton of weathered stone and splintered wood, its windows shattered, its walls overtaken by creeping vines and moss. The grounds are littered with debris-broken toys, rusted bed frames, tattered remnants of uniforms, faint echoes of the children who once lived, laughed, and ultimately vanished within these walls. The chapel, once a place of rigid sermons and whispered rituals, stands hollow, the rotted pews sagging beneath years of damp, its altar stained and cracked. And around the perimeter, scattered among the overgrown grave markers of forgotten orphans, symbols carved deep into the stone remain visible, faded, eroded by time, yet unmistakably present. For those who remain in the nearby towns, the wounds have never fully healed. The disappearance of the girls is more than an unsolved mystery. It is a scar carved into the community's collective memory, a source of whispered fears and unanswered questions that have outlived generations. Some families still clutch faded photographs of daughters, sisters, nieces' young faces frozen in time, their smiles haunting reminders of lives suspended in the void. Others refuse to speak of Bellevue at all, their silence a barrier against reopening old wounds, a futile attempt to contain the darkness to the past. The official investigation into the vanishing went cold within 5 years. Authorities, overwhelmed by dead-end leads, conflicting witness accounts, and missing evidence, quietly withdrew resources, classifying the case as unresolved but dormant. No bodies were ever recovered, no suspects charged. Thomas Pike and Reverend Mercer remain missing, their fates unknown, their names entwined with endless speculation and folklore. Yet the unanswered questions have only deepened with time. How could 22 children disappear without a trace? Why were the orphanage's records, incomplete entire days, staff logs, and correspondence wiped from existence? Who carved the symbols found along the cliffs, in the woods, beneath the floorboards? And perhaps most chillingly, was the tragedy the result of human malice, mass manipulation? Or, as some still whisper, something far older and darker, rooted in the cliffs, the sea, and the forgotten rituals of generations past? Paranormal investigators, drawn by rumors of hauntings and spectral sightings, have visited the Bellevue ruins over the years. Many report strange occurrences, disembodied voices, sudden temperature drops, unexplained symbols appearing overnight. Skeptics dismiss these as coincidence or overactive imagination, yet the reports persist. Some claim to have seen figures on the cliffs at dusk, shadows that disappear when approached, fleeting glimpses of young girls staring out to sea, their features indistinct beneath the lingering fog. In academic circles, Bellevue remains a case study in mass hysteria, institutional failure, and the psychological impact of isolation. But among folklorists and locals, the orphanage is whispered about as a place cursed long before its doors ever opened, the location where land, sea, and human frailty intersect in dangerous, inexplicable ways. The old legends of coastal Maine still circulate, stories of the sea's demand, of offerings made to protect the town, of ancient forces beneath the waves that cannot be seen, only appeased. Even the land itself bears the mark of unresolved tragedy. The forest surrounding Bellview is unnaturally still, the cliffs eroded into jagged, ominous shapes. Strange symbols continue to appear etched into trees, stones, and even newly constructed buildings' graffiti. According to some, warnings, according to others, despite multiple attempts to redevelop the orphanage grounds. Each project has been abandoned, plagued by structural collapses, equipment malfunctions, or workers walking off the job, unwilling to continue under what many describe as an oppressive, unsettling atmosphere for the families of the missing girls. Closure remains an unattainable dream. Year after year, they hold quiet vigils by the cliffs, leaving flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes. Near the old stone markers, their pleas for answers carried off by the wind. Some have passed on, their lives ending without resolution. Others persist, driven by the hope that the truth, however dark, might one day emerge from the fog of secrecy and fear. Today, Bellview stands as both a decaying monument and a lingering enigma, its ruins entwined with grief, rumor, and unresolved horror. Journalists, researchers, and conspiracy theorists continue to explore its history, unearthing fragments of evidence, connecting old testimonies, uncovering whispers of forgotten rites, but never reaching definitive answers. The deeper they dig, the more the boundaries between fact and folklore blur, leaving only unsettling possibilities behind. The trauma of Bellview extends beyond the cliffs, rippling through generations, shaping the identity of the community, embedding itself in local cautionary tales, schoolyard rumors, and the uneasy silences that follow any mention of the orphanage. It remains a symbol of unanswered questions, a chilling reminder of how easily the vulnerable can disappear, how secrecy festers in isolation, and how the past, when buried beneath ritual and fear, refuses to stay hidden. Decades later, no answers have come. Only questions persisted into the land, woven into the fog, embedded in memory. Bellevue's ruins crumble, its graves overgrown, yet the shadows remain. The sea continues to batter the cliffs, the mist rolls in with every tide, and the whispers of the lost drift endlessly through the trees unanswered, unresolved, and unforgettable. The tragedy of Bellview Orphanage has spawned countless theories over the decades, each one attempting to stitch together fragments of evidence, whispers of testimony, and the decaying ruins that still loom over Maine's jagged cliffs. The official investigation may have long since faded into the archives, but the questions have only deepened, each theory a competing lens through which to interpret. What happened to the 22 missing girls on that storm-lashed night in 1977? Was it human greed, the descent into madness, or were the disappearances the consequence of something far older and darker forces that defy rational explanation? The truth remains fragmented, elusive, and, some argue, deliberately buried beneath layers of fear, folklore, and forgotten history. The most conventional theory, and perhaps the one favored by law enforcement at the time, rests firmly within the realm of human malabduction and trafficking. The late 1970s marked a surge in awareness of organized child exploitation networks, with growing concern over vulnerable populations like orphans, particularly in remote, poorly supervised institutions like Bellevue. Some investigators believed the disappearance was orchestrated by human traffickers exploiting the orphanage's isolation and lax oversight. The missing records, the absence of visitors logged in the final days, and the staff's suspicious behavior seemed to support this. Detractors of this theory, however, point to the sheer scale of the event when 2 girls vanished without a single witness, sound, or trace, an operation that would have required extraordinary coordination, secrecy, and local complicity, all without anyone breaking silence in the decades that followed. Closely linked to the abduction theory is the possibility of an internal cover-up. Bellevue's administration, led by headmistress Evelyn Harrow and supported by figures like Reverend Caleb Mercer, wielded significant control over both the orphanage and the vulnerable children within it. Surviving staff testimonies, along with fragments of journals and hidden records, suggest an atmosphere of coercion, discipline, and secrecy cultivated within Bellevue's walls. Some theorists argue that the disappearances resulted from criminal negligence or institutional abuse. Gone horribly wronger, tragedy that those in power scrambled to conceal. Missing logs, destroyed evidence, and the rapid withdrawal of authorities in the following years lend weight to suspicions of an orchestrated internal silencing. But the theories extend beyond conventional crime. Many point to the increasingly erratic behavior of Reverend Mercer and his obsession with ritualistic practices disguised as religious instruction. Mercer's sermons grew darker and more apocalyptic in the months before the vanishing, peppered with cryptic references to ancient hunger's the sea's debt and blessings paid in blood, combined with symbols discovered throughout the orphanage markings, eerily aligned with known occult iconography. Some believe Bellevue fell prey to cultic manipulation. Cult experts have drawn parallels between Bellevue and other historical examples of closed, insular groups descending into ritual practice under the guise of faith or tradition. The presence of maritime folklore, carvings on the cliffs, animal sacrifices found in the woods, and consistent symbols etched across the grounds support the theory of Bellevue as a hidden cult operating under the town's nose. In this version of events, the children were either indoctrinated into or sacrificed for the cult's beliefs, their disappearances framed as part of a larger clandestine ritual designed to protect the town or appease a supernatural force. This brings forth the theory most heavily shrouded in fear and speculation, that the vanishing of the girls was not purely human-driven, but the consequence of darker, possibly supernatural forces tied to the region's history. Coastal Maine has long been steeped in folklore tales of cursed cliffs, ancient sea deities, and the tides that hunger, predating colonial settlements. Oral histories, passed through generations, speak of offerings made to ensure safe fishing, of foundlings marked by fate, of towns protected only through appeasement rituals whispered beneath the waves. The symbols carved into Bellevue's chapel, scrawled in the children's sketches, and etched into the cliff's mirror iconography, associated with obscure maritime cults and pre-Christian traditions aimed at controlling or bargaining with the unknown. Some theorists claim these rituals were not abandoned with time, but merely hidden beneath the facade of Christian charity and institutional care. Bellevue, isolated on the cliffs, became both sanctuary and altar its children, raised not merely as orphans, but as potential offerings in a system of belief older than the orphanage itself. Supporting this supernatural angle are the strange, unexplainable events surrounding the case, the eerie light seen along the cliffs, the mutilated animals, the reports of chanting and shadowy figures, the deep, resonating sounds heard beneath the waves in the days before the vanishing. Even after the orphanage's closure, sightings of figures near the ruins, fresh symbols appearing overnight, and the oppressive atmosphere reported by visitors lend credence to the belief that, something otherworldly still lingers. Skeptics dismiss these as folklore-fueled hysteria, fueled by the human brain's desperate attempt to explain tragedy through myth. Yet others argue that dismissing such patterns outright ignores centuries of ritualistic tradition and the power of belief to shape reality, whether psychological or paranormal in origin. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that the truth lies in the intersection of all these theories, confluence of human corruption, psychological manipulation, cultural folklore, and rituals so ingrained in the fabric of the town that they blurred the boundaries between fiction and fact. Bellview, in this reading, became the stage for a multi-layered tragedy. Isolated children, manipulated by trusted authority figures, subjected to rituals believed to protect the community, all under the suffocating weight of generational superstition and fear. In this interpretation, the vanishing was neither entirely human nor entirely supernatural. It was the product of belief itself, weaponized, where tradition, fear, and control merged into a reality where 22 girls could disappear, swallowed by the cliffs, the sea, or the collective silence of those too afraid to challenge the old ways. Decades later, the theories remain as fractured as the crumbling ruins of Bellview itself. Each piece of evidence, each hidden testimony, each symbol etched into the stone adds to the puzzle. But the full picture remains deliberately out of reach, obscured by time. Human failure, and perhaps something darker still woven into the land. Was it human greed, spiraling madness, or forces beyond reason? Or was it all of them threads of darkness braided together, burying the truth beneath fear and fog? What is certain is that the scars of Bellview endure. The ruins still stand, overgrown and decaying, the graves forgotten, the cliffs battered by endless waves, the community bound by silence and unanswered questions. And in the lingering shadows, the symbols remain, whispering that the truth, fragmented and elusive, was never meant to be found, only feared, buried, and remembered in fragments. Generation after generation, though the tragedy of Bellview Orphanage remains one of the most haunting and mysterious mass disappearances in modern American history, the unsettling truth is that its story is not entirely unique. Across continents, scattered over decades and, in some cases, centuries, similar patterns have emerged. Isolated institutions, vulnerable children, ritualistic symbols, unexplained vanishings, and communities silenced by fear. When researchers and investigative journalists began to examine the Bellview case within a broader global context, disturbing parallels surfaced, echoes of the same darkness repeating across borders, across oceans, suggesting either a shared cultural phenomenon or something far more coordinated and ominous. In rural Romania, 1932, an incident eerily reminiscent of Bellview unfolded at St. Anna's Asylum for abandoned girls, hidden deep within the Carpathian Mountains. Official reports state that 11 girls aged 6 to 14 vanished overnight from their dormitory. Local authorities blamed wolves, severe weather, or human trafficking, but photographs from the asylum grounds, uncovered decades later, revealed ancient symbols carved into surrounding trees and stone outcropping symbols nearly identical to those later discovered at Bellview. Survivors spoke in hushed tones of the offering ceremony, where children were marked and chosen, their disappearance framed as a ritual appeasement to the spirits of the mountains. The case was buried under communist-era secrecy, but whispers of St. Diana's persist in Romanian folklore to this day. Across the Atlantic, in Chile's coastal Valparaiso region, 1956 brought another chillingly similar event. A Catholic-run boarding school, La Casa del Refugio, reported the disappearance of 15 children following weeks of strange occurrences, symbols etched into the cliffs, mutilated seabirds found along the shore, and reports of chanting heard from the school's chapel after midnight. Fishermen claimed to see hooded figures near the water's edge during storms, their torches flickering along the rocks. Despite extensive searches and international headlines, the children were never found, and authorities swiftly shut down the school, citing structural instability and criminal negligence. Yet local urban legends speak of the Marinus Antigus, ancient sea spirits demanding sacrifice, with ceremonies allegedly hidden beneath layers of Catholic doctrine, an unnerving mirror to the Bellview narrative in 1969. A similar tale unfolded in Nagano Prefecture, Japan, where the isolated Hoshikawa Institute for Orphaned Girls reported a mass disappearance of 12 residents following a series of unexplained phenomena: glowing lights in the nearby forests, strange geometric carvings appearing overnight, and local villagers warning of the return of the forest guardians. Journal entries recovered from abandoned institute files detail children marked with unfamiliar symbols, secret rituals conducted by institute staff, and persistent references to appeasing the mountain spirits. Though officially dismissed as a landslide tragedy, folklorists have long drawn connections between the Hoshikawa incident and ancient Shinto legends of human offerings to forest deities, suggesting a cultural continuity with other global disappearances, framed in ritual and mythology closer to home in the Canadian Maritimes. 1984 saw the unexplained vanishing of 9 children from St. Elspeth's Home for Foundlings, located on Nova Scotia's remote Cape Breton Island. The investigation revealed chilling consistencies: symbols carved into the cliffs, reports of ritual gatherings along the coast, and cryptic references to the sea's covenant within church records. Once again, local superstition merged with institutional secrecy, silencing inquiries and framing the tragedy as an isolated, unexplainable loss. Yet when those symbols were compared to markings at Bellevue and similar sites worldwide, the shared iconography, the same interlocking circles, jagged lines, and nautical motifs, was undeniable. What emerges from this global pattern is deeply unsettling. Across continents, across decades, vulnerable children in isolated institutions vanished under circumstances laced with folklore, ritual symbols, and communal silence. Despite cultural differences, European mountain spirits, South American sea legends, East Asian forest guardians, North American maritime myths, thematic core remains hauntingly consistent. The blending of religious institutions with esoteric rituals, the use of symbols to mark both places and people, the manipulation of fear and tradition to cloak unthinkable acts, and the subsequent erasure or distortion of evidence. Experts argue over the meaning of these parallels. Some anthropologists suggest the incidents reflect universal human fears: the loss of children, the power of isolation, and the psychological need to explain tragedy through supernatural narratives. Others point to sociological factors: how marginalized groups, particularly orphans, become easy targets for exploitation cloaked behind tradition, whether in coastal Maine or rural Romania. But a more chilling possibility lingers beneath the academic debates that these are not isolated cultural echoes, but interconnected, systemic events rooted in an ancient belief system transcending borders. Investigative journalist Caleb Voss, who spent years comparing Bellevue with similar global cases, posited that what we're seeing is a fragmented but coordinated belief structure hidden beneath folklore. passed through secretive channels over generations, using isolation, vulnerability, and ritual as tools to achieve a dark, unified purpose. Voss's controversial work compiled photographs, survivor testimonies, and forensic analysis showing undeniable links between these cases. The symbols carved into Bellevue's walls match those found in Valparaiso, Hoshikawa, Cape Breton, and beyond, symbols tied to nautical folklore, fertility rituals, and sacrificial traditions dating back to pre-Christian times. The rituals, described by survivors' markings on the skin, selection ceremonies, late-night processions, appear across continents with disturbing consistency. And in each case, authorities' responses were marked by missing records, suppressed evidence, and rapid institutional closures. Skeptics dismiss Voss's theories as conspiracy-fueled speculation, but the mounting evidence remains hard to ignore. Patterns of vanishing children, ritual symbols, community silence, and fragmented historical records repeat with unsettling regularity from South America to Eastern Europe to Asia. For the families of Bellevue's lost girls, these parallels offer no comfort, only deeper questions. Are these incidents mere coincidence, products of human failing wrapped in myth, or are they glimpses into a hidden system of belief, a global tradition buried beneath folklore, surfacing only when fear, isolation, and opportunity converge? Today, researchers continue to map these incidents, plotting them on timelines and global charts, connecting dots across oceans, mountains, and generations. And with each new discovery, the line between myth and reality blurs further, leaving behind only one haunting certainty: from Maine to Romania, Chile to Japan, the same symbols, the same fears, and the same chilling disappearances echo across time and geography, whispers of a darkness that refuses to be bound by borders or forgotten by history. The ruins of Bellview Orphanage stand weathered and broken, battered by decades of coastal storms, salt air, and silence. Yet, as the wind sighs through the skeletal remains of shattered windows and collapsing walls, it carries faint echoes, fragments of voices long thought erased. Laughter, singing, whispers carried through the pines and over the cliffs, reminders that though time erodes stone and memory alike, some shadows refuse to fade. The story of Bellevue is not just a tale of loss, but of absence of 22 young girls who vanished without a trace, swallowed by fog, superstition, and the suffocating silence of a community desperate to forget. Their names faded from official records, their faces blurred with time, their belongings once neatly arranged in dormitories overlooking the restless sea, now rotting among the ruins. And yet their presence lingers in every unanswered question, in every symbol carved deep into the cliffs, in every uneasy glance exchanged among those who still remember. It is easy, decades later, to dismiss the tragedy of Bellevue as an anomaly, haunting footnote in the long, shadowed history of forgotten institutions. But as investigators, journalists, and those left behind have learned, the story is far more complicated and far more enduring. The patterns repeat, the symbols resurface, the whispers drift in from the sea, layered with cautionary tales of those who disappear when no one listens. For the families of the missing girls, closure remains elusive. Some have spent their lives chasing fragments, faded photographs, cryptic testimonies, hidden archives buried beneath bureaucracy and fear. Others have retreated into silence, guarding their grief like a fragile ember, unwilling to reopen the wound And among them all lingers the quiet, unspoken terror that perhaps their daughters were not simply victims of human cruelty or institutional failure, but part of something older, darker, and still unfinished. The unanswered questions loom larger with each passing year. What truly happened in the final days before the vanishing? What did the symbols carved into stone, hidden in journals, etched on the cliffs truly mean? Were the rituals whispered about in hidden testimonies the desperate inventions of frightened children, or echoes of forgotten rites buried beneath the region's folklore? Was it greed, madness, or something beyond reason that claimed 22 lives? And perhaps most disturbing, why have similar patterns, etched across continents and generations, continued to emerge? From the cliffs of Maine to the mountains of Romania, the shores of Chile, the forests of Japan, the same threads of disappearance. Ritual and silence weave a global tapestry of unanswered horrors. For some, the ruins of Bellevue are merely a decaying structure, a relic of the past, best left to rot. But for others, they stand as a warning, a reminder of how icily vulnerable lives can vanish when fear, tradition, and secrecy intersect. A symbol of how some communities bury truths beneath folklore, how silence can shield darkness, and how belief, whether rooted in myth or reality, can manipulate generations. The sea continues to batter the cliffs. The fog rolls in without warning, blanketing the ruins, the overgrown graves, and the scars of a tragedy unresolved. And in the twilight hours, when the mist hangs heavy and the pines whisper in the wind, those who listen closely swear they still hear them, the faint echoes of forgotten voices, the lingering laughter of children lost to time, reminders that beneath the soil, the stone, and the silence, the shadows of Bellevue endure. 22 girls, erased, forgotten by history, yet not entirely gone. Their shadows linger in the unanswered questions, in the ritual symbols resurfacing even now. In every frightened glance cast toward the cliffs, they linger in the rusted playground, the crumbling chapel, the stories that refuse to die. They linger in the pines that sway against a grey sky, whispering secrets passed down in hushed tones, as if warning those willing to listen that some mysteries, some horrors, never be buried and never be forgotten. Bellevue remains a monument to the unresolved, a decaying reminder that silence, secrecy, and fear can eclipse even the most vulnerable among us. But their voices, faint as they may be, still call out across time. And as we reflect on the questions left behind the strange symbols, the forgotten testimonies, the global patterns repeating in the shadows, we are left with a chilling truth. Some mysteries fade with time, but others refuse to die.